If you've ever tried to connect two apps together or build an automation, you've probably heard terms like HTTP request, webhook, bearer authentication, APIs, and chances are it just sounds like a foreign language. In this video, I'm going to break down all these concepts in actual plain English so that you actually understand what you're doing when you're building these automations. By the end, you're going to understand exactly what webhooks and HTTP requests are, how to use each one, when to use each one, how they work, and how to read API documentation so you can connect basically any app you want to n8n. Then we're going to jump into n8n and actually put these into practice so you can see real examples of how all of these are used. So now I'm going to jump over to our Miro board here. And the first thing that we're going to go over is what is an API. API stands for Application Programming Interface. And the best example that I like for explaining what an API is a waiter at a restaurant. So when you go to a restaurant, obviously you want food, right? But you can't just walk into the kitchen and get the food out of the kitchen. So you tell the waiter what you want to eat, and then he communicates to the kitchen and then brings the food to you. So the waiter in this example is the API. Another example that you've probably seen before is when you go into a website and you see this kind of sign in with Google card. This website is using Google's API to verify your identity. So an API is the middleman between two apps. You can see this diagram here. This right here, arrow right here, is the API. It connects two apps and it's the middleman. Think of an API just in simplest terms for the rest of this video. Just an API is how two apps communicate with each other. These APIs are all documented in API documentation, which most websites have. And it's sort of like a set of rules for how you can communicate with two apps together and get all this information. We're going to go into how to read API documentation later on in this video, because that's definitely something that you need to know. But now let's go into what is an HTTP request. So if you've used n8n before, you likely have seen this node. It's probably the most common one, and this is just an HTTP request node. What an HTTP request stands for is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. You've probably also seen HTTPS or HTTP with the colon and 2 slashes before every website. I can pop up the Miro board right here. I'm sure it has a HTTPS right here. So what this is doing when I'm on Miro is it's sending an HTTP request to a server, and the server sends back the web page. So right now, if I were to look up HTTPS ://google.com, I'm sending an HTTP request to google.com and it's returning me this web page. So that's an HTTP request. It has 4 parts to it. So you're going to have client, request, server, response, client. So let's use the google.com example. We're making a request to google.com, and then we have the server, and then the response, we're seeing the web page coming back to us, the client. So in automations, we use HTTP requests to ask an API for data or to send data to an API. And there's 4 main HTTP request methods that we're going to use. There are more than this, but you're really going to use these 4. Mostly, honestly, these 2 they get in the post request. So in a GET request, which you select this here in n8n, you can see kind of the other options, but we're mostly use guest and post. We'll go over a couple others in this video, but in a GET request, you're asking for data. So it's like, hey, give me a list of all my customers. You're not changing anything. You're not making any changes through the API. You're just reading the data. You're getting the data. In a post request, you're creating something new. So, hey, add this new customer to my database, or add a row to a Google Sheet. So you're sending data to create a new record. So you're creating something new. In a GET request, you're reading what's already there. A PUT request, you're updating something that already exists. So, hey, update this customer's email in my CRM. So you're modifying the existing data that's already there. And in a delete request, pretty self-explanatory. You're just deleting customers from the database. So if you want to think about it in simple terms, GET requests read, post requests create, PUT requests update, and delete requests delete. So that is the basis of HTTP requests. Now, the next thing we want to go over is going to be webhooks. So first, you need to understand the difference between an HTTP request and a webhook, because they're oftentimes confused. I'm actually going to show you what a webhook looks like in n8n, because that's oftentimes a trigger. So this is a webhook where you have a GET request. The request types are very similar. GET and post are really the ones you're usually going to use, but there's also delete. So then you're going to have test URLs, production URLs. You can change the path here. So say I wanted to do like a webhook for a new email. So that would be the path for that webhook URL. But let's not get too off track yet. So An example of what an HTTP request looks like compared to a webhook. So an HTTP request would be you order food and then you call the restaurant every 5 minutes to ask them if your food is ready yet. So you're constantly polling, you're constantly making these requests. Eventually they're going to say yes, and then you go get the food. A webhook is you give the restaurant your address, you say, just bring it to me when it's ready, and they show up at your door when the food is done. That is an example of a webhook. So say maybe you have a webhook for a new email. So n8n actually has a native Gmail node for a trigger. But if we were to go to Gmail here and go to our triggers, this is a webhook. It's just packaged nicely. They already have like the authentication and like this kind of the preset fields done for you. But this Gmail trigger is a webhook so that every time I get an email, it's sending to an n8n webhook, and then I can add more nodes, more workflow items past that. An HTTP request in that example would be polling your inbox every so off seconds or whatever to see when you get new emails. So with HTTP requests, you're asking for information. So you are requesting to the app for information. With webhooks, the other app tells you when something happens. So you're not constantly polling for this information. So when to use which? HTTP requests would be if you want to check something on a schedule, if you need to pull data on demand, or you want to create, update, or delete data in another app. Webhooks would be when you want to react to events in real time, if you don't want to constantly check if something happened, or if the other app supports webhooks, because oftentimes it's just easier to use webhooks than HTTP requests, especially as triggers. So if you're triggering a workflow, webhooks, a lot easier. Now, we're going to go into API authentication a little bit. I'm not going to go super deep into this, but you can't just send an API request to any website and pull any data anywhere. That would not be good, because you could get data from literally anywhere just by making an HTTP request. So you'll see here that you have authentication and you have some different credential types. So bearer auth, header auth, OAuth, query auth, custom auth. There's a lot of different things. You don't have to use the credential type here. You can actually create your own within the headers. I'm not going to go super in depth into this, but let's hop back over here. So there's two main ways you're going to authenticate. The first one is an API key, which is basically like a password. So the API is going to go in one of three places. One would be in the URL as a query parameter. Second one would be in the headers as an API key. And the third would be in the request body. The API documentation, again, I'm going to go into that like down here, but the API documentation is going to tell you exactly where to put the API key when you are creating this HTTP request here. The second way that you might authenticate is through bearer authentication. So this is a more secure authentication. It uses OAuth. So a big difference here as well is that API keys don't usually expire. Sometimes they do, but typically they don't. Bearer authentication and OAuth does expire, so you have to change them out, but it is more secure. So bearer tokens are going to go in the authorization header, like how I showed you before, where you would add a header and it would be like authorization, and your bearer token would be in the value here. So it would be like bearer, and then you would type the token. But again, the API documentation for whatever website you're making an HTTP request to is going to tell you exactly how to do it. So main difference, API keys, simpler, usually don't expire, tied to your account. Bearer tokens are more secure, often expire, and are tied to a specific user or session. So now I want to go over API documentation briefly, just so you have an idea of what it is and how you can connect any app. So every website that you're going to want to connect, or every app, is going to have some sort of API documentation. Typically, you can find it by going to developers.thewebsite.com. So say ClickUp is the CRM that we use. So developers.clickup.com. So now would be the API documentation for ClickUp. Let's see if it actually pops up or not. That might actually just go to my ClickUp base. So let's try ClickUp API documentation. So you can go to developer.clickup.com. There's no S. That was the difference. But you can go to guides, and you now have a bunch of guides for what the APIs look like. So the get task API returns like this. And maybe you have there's a million different things you can do here. with webhooks, you have communication, you have views, all that. You can go to the API reference, which is where I'll spend most of my time, because the biggest thing here, so say I wanted to create a new folder in ClickUp every time I got a new client, and that would like house all the clients' videos and to-do lists and whatnot. You can take this CURL or curl request, I say curl, but you can copy it and then you can put it, import curl here, and then it's going to have that template for you to go and fill everything out. So I would have to put my space ID right here. So this would be like whatever my space ID is. And yeah, like that's the authentication that you need for ClickUp specifically. You would actually go to a predefined credential type. And actually this is something I want to mention. So I'm connecting to the ClickUp API. n8n packages these access tokens very nicely. This is my ClickUp API token, and it's just packaged nicely in n8n so that I don't have to put it in the headers every single time. So that's another way to connect through credentials. But again, it's just connecting through an API key. It just looks nicer and it's way easier because you don't have to put it in the headers. But you can see here, this is ClickUp API documentation where you have all of these different things. And this is exactly how you're going to make HTTP requests. So say I want to delete a goal. You would copy this curl request, put it into n8n just in that import curl button, this little button here. You can import the curl command, and a curl is essentially like a template for an HTTP request. Another API documentation might be Notion. I don't use Notion, but here's kind of how I would go about doing that. Say I wanted to create a new page. I would go here, and this is going to be all of like the property values of the page. I'm going to go to guides actually. Let's see. Sometimes these are better off, honestly, if you were to go and like feed all of this to Claude so that it can kind of help you do everything. Okay, here we go. Create a page. So here's the curl request to create a new page in Notion. So I would go ahead, copy this curl request, hop over to n8n, say I wanted to create a new page in Notion, import the curl command, and you can see that this is bearer auth. So we have the header name is authorization, and then value is going to be bearer, and then we need our Notion API key. Again, I don't use Notion, so I don't have an API key, but then it's going to have the version, and then it's going to send the body using JSON. So this is going to be to create a new page in Notion. So fairly simple, but it is super important that you know how to read API documentation, because every automation that you see, like when somebody is creating an automation that it hasn't been created as a YouTube tutorial or something, you need to use the API documentation. Like that's how you go in and create automations from scratch, because this is where the information all originates. So retrieve a page, that's an example of a GET request. If I wanted to retrieve a page in Notion, a patch request, I'm not actually going to go over that now, but a patch is essentially like updating something. So a patch request would be to update a page. So let's go into, actually, let me see where we are here. So we did go through this, went through that, and did go through examples. So you should have a fairly good idea of how to read API documentation. Again, there are a couple websites that are super helpful with this. One of them being firecrawl.dev. In Firecrawl, you can scrape markdowns of anything. So say I wanted to scrape the markdown of creating a key result in ClickUp. I would just copy this URL, go put it into Firecrawl, and it's going to scrape everything on that site. So this is how I would go about creating an automation, where I would feed it the API reference here. For some reason, it's not logging me into my account, but you would download this markdown, and then you can just feed that to Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, whatever, and then ask it how you would go about doing this in n8n, and you can troubleshoot using Claude or ChatGPT now that it actually has the reference to the API documentation. Best example, I think, of a webhook would be when someone fills out a form. So I'm going to go to fill out forms, which is something that it's just like a free form builder. And I'm going to create a fill out form called YouTube test. So we'll just go light, and that looks good. And here is where you'd go and like configure the webhook. So I'm just going to give it like a super simple question there, and then go to integrate, and under integrations, you should have an option for webhook. So for this webhook, we're going to go and create that in n8n. So we're going to create a webhook in n8n. This is going to be a post request because the fill out is going to be sending us new data. And this is just going to be like YT-fillout. The path, just do something you'll remember. It doesn't really matter. And let's actually go, we'll go to a test URL, go here, listen for test event, and let's send a test event from fill out and see if that worked. Seems like it worked here. Head here, and you can now see this is what we're getting. So name, what's your name? Type short answer, and value is where the answer would be. Obviously, this is a test event, so we don't have a value. For HTTP request, you hit tab, create a new node, go to HTTP request, and we're going to get just a random joke from this website. No authentication, no anything. We're just going to get a joke. Let's see what we get. Let's go to ignore SSL issues in, actually, that would be here. Perfect. Just run this way. So now what we did was make a get request to this website. So say I go to quotable.io. It's just a bunch of like jokes and quotes and stuff. So what I'm doing is making an API call. So we're using an API, which you can see here. So we're using n8n, and we're communicating with Quotable through an HTTP request. So we're asking Quotable to give us a quote. And our quote was, a man may fulfill the object of his existence by asking a question he cannot answer and attempting a task he cannot achieve. So you can see we get a quote return there via a GET request in n8n. So that's a very basic rundown of how you can use HTTP requests in webhooks. Basic recap of what we went over in this video. APIs, how apps talk to each other. HTTP requests are how you ask or send data. Webhooks are how other apps send data to you automatically. Authentication proves who you are, usually through API keys or bearer tokens. API docs tell you exactly how to use an API. Focus on the endpoints and the examples. And also I want to add focus on the curl, because that's what you can copy and paste right into n8n. I'm going to be posting n8n tutorials just like this every single day. So subscribe, don't miss them. If you want all the JSON drag and drop templates that I use in the tutorials, just join my free school community. The first link in the description.